Thank you, John Madera. Thank you, Big Other. My name is Eugene Lim, and I'll be reading from my novel called Search History. Around then, around then, I had gotten into the habit of playing Climate Change, which is a virtual reality video game where you are one of variously weaponized cyborgs playing on one of an infinite number of generated island landscapes. Every time you would fire your weapon, the island you were on would lose a slight bit of mass, which in the physics of the game world would have the effect of the island sinking ever so slightly. Your goal, as I understood it, was to kill or capture your opponents before the island disappeared. What's more, if held in captivity long enough, or by feeding them the glory energy you earned with each kill, the labor of your captured opponents could be harnessed to create slight bits of mass to add back to the island. It was a very addictive game, I continued. The dream was to be the ruler of an enormous island where all your opponents either slaughtered or captured. But usually we would spawn onto a randomly chosen landscape and find not a powerful Midas to topple, but rather a ferocious battle to engage in, one where all the combatants would eventually drown above a disappeared island, just to eventually respawn in yet another similarly ending battle on yet another doomed island, a never-ending cycle. The political and environmental metaphor was only too obvious. And the sophomoric irony of the gameplay, I'm afraid, only made it that much more enjoyable for us. One day, Frank came over and saw my gaming rig, a full room devoted to virtual reality with a levitating cage, weather machine, multiplayer goggles, and suits. He'd never seen one before. Can I play? He immediately asked. Of course, I said. I was only too happy and grateful for the chance to play with someone, so to speak, in real life. Right away, it was a blast. It was very exciting because it wasn't just me talking or texting to an anonymous teammate I'd randomly been paired with, but rather it was a notable someone, a person I could feel and hear in the room, though feel and hear were, of course, mediated acts by the software and the outfits. Nevertheless, it felt different, special. We spawned into one of my favorite landscapes, a series of ruined castles whose dungeons and moats had already lost their identities to become uncanny aquariums and canyons. As outfitted cyborgs, we could continue the battle for a limited time underwater and had as well various methods, jets and propellers and fins and ballasts for aquatic navigation. The level of our air tanks glowed in a green bar on our screen before shortening to a threatening yellow rectangle and then a blinking squat red square. We began on the turret, and I beckoned Frank over to peer through one of its huge crenels. From there, we saw the unlikely span of several hundred meters of castle architecture rising out of an infinite obsidian sea, both the granite walls and the great ocean opalescent with planed and glinting reflections. Hiding, I texted him, and then leapt off the tower into the sea. Even as I tumbled through the air, I split my screen to watch also from Frank's POV, and so saw him look around and at first hesitate. But then he gathered his courage and took a few steps back, and he too jumped off the edge. I knew he was hearing and feeling the exhilarating rush of wind from his 20-story drop, and then a few seconds later, the sweet crunch of his suit and the weather machine simulating the impact into the water. He turned to me, and I saw his big grin as well as my own mirrored in the split screen. Wow, he said. Yep, I said. We swam through a burst drawbridge into the lower floors of the castle. Approaching a large ballroom, we saw the flashes and heard the water-muffled explosions of battle. I checked our oxygen levels and we exchanged nods. Even though this was my billionth time playing, I felt a trickle of sweat run down the collar of my suit. I was both excited and slightly nervous. I wanted to impress Frank. As expected from his various trainings, Frank was a natural, though of course there were idiosyncrasies of both the game and my rig to become accustomed to. Nonetheless, it felt great entering into the pitch with him. He demonstrated a wicked accuracy and quickly racked up several kills in the room before I signaled that it was time to jet up to the surface. There, I let my guard down and was tackled by a player who had been hiding behind a column. She was without weapons and must have recently escaped one of the prisons and had been waiting in ambush to quickly pick up some weaponry. She and I were locked in a life and death grapple, splashing around the room, which was slowly being flooded. She'd obviously bought an expensive Brazilian jiu-jitsu enhancement, or was just well-trained, and had almost choked me into unconsciousness before Frank, who had surfaced moments after me, but smartly, quietly, took her out with a carefully aimed paralysis dart. I think she'll make a great captive, I wheezed out, as I showed Frank how to teleport her into our designated prison factory. This is great, Frank said a moment later after I'd caught my breath. Yeah, I said, isn't it? That day we spent several hours playing, and from then on, Frank was hooked. We had work and all of life's obligations, of course, but every chance we got, we'd game. In the beginning, it was always these first-person shooter games. Occasionally, we'd try a racing or a hand-to-hand combat or a spaceship, but those first few years we always went back to games like climate change, shooters, where we tromped through different, but in fact very similar terrains, holding different, but very similar weapons, to look around different, but very similar corners in order to annihilate, usually in bloody or explosive fashion, the virtual bodies of randos and baddies, which were, from our point of view, very much redundant terms. A few years into our habit, however, Frank came over and said he'd learned about a different kind of game. It was called Avant Gardener, and despite a great skepticism at first, we downloaded it and began to play. What kind of game is it? I'd asked. It's a garden simulator, he said. What? I'd asked. You are a gardener, he explained. And you garden. We garden? Yeah, you get to garden any kind of garden you wish. Any kind of garden. Yeah, and the details are incredibly crisp. Everything is diamond pixeled, all hyper-rendered, and almost each master viewpoint is hand-composed. Frank's understanding of the technical specifications had long ago eclipsed mine, but I got his general drift. I looked at him quizzically and stammered, "You're saying the point of, I'm not sure. The idea is we pretend to garden? Yes, but any garden you like." "We're gardeners," I repeated. "Yes. Just puttering around in the dirt, any kind of dirt you can imagine. And that's it." "There are enhancements," Frank said. I perked up. "What kind?" "You can speed up time. You can choose to control the weather or let the simulation mirror the exact conditions of any location on Earth." "Oh," I said, not very impressed. "Let's try it." "Let's not." "Oh, come on." "Oh, okay," I said. It took me a while to appreciate the game. At first, I found it dull, or thought I did, as it was repetitive and, despite the game's impressive attention to detail, still clearly a virtual landscape, and so seemed at first a shadow, if not a mockery, of the real. But over time, I started to get into it. I liked especially to manipulate the weather just slightly from actual recorded conditions. I'd turn day into night and garden in the cooler temperatures under a full moon. Or I'd order up a sweet breeze and strategically position a cloud to block direct sun on just my position. Little accommodations like this were a godsend, though Frank, in his garden, just a world seemed over. We could talk to each other as if we were in the same room, which we were, even if his was a peony farm in China and mine was a lettuce crop in Alaska. He was a relative purist and would not deviate from the actual mirrored conditions of wherever in the world his garden was supposed to be located. And instead of speeding up time, as I would, to see ranunculus bloom or vines rise across a trellis, he would just create a different garden on the other side of the world so that he always had something to tend to and something beautiful to observe or something hitting its peak to harvest. But we didn't really master the game until several months later when Frank introduced a chemical element to it. He'd read about online and tracked down special, quote, peripherals. These were custom-made, game-specific psychoactives that hacked the limbic system. He'd mentioned them one day, and I shrugged, but then the following week, he said he'd had them. "What's it called?" I asked, eyeing the drug. I was relatively inexperienced and doubtful about these pharmaceutical enhancements. "Final Boss," Frank said, placing the gummy worm onto my palm. I looked at the gelatinous green and yellow creature in my hand. Then I looked up to meet Frank's eye. "Well," I said, smiling a little because I trusted him and because we seemed to always have fun together. "Let's garden," and I popped the worm into my mouth. Thank you.